The third level of ecology is called community ecology, and a community is the assemblage of all of the species that live close enough together for a potential interaction. And one thing that we do in community ecology that's really important is we talk about diversity, how diverse a community is relative to another community. So if you quickly look at these two pictures of trees, you may say, well, of course, the one on the top is more diverse, but what would be your reason for that? When I ask students this, I usually get, oh, well, there's more species on the top. But if you look close, there's actually 4 species of trees on the top: pine tree, this lighter green tree, this kind of maple-looking tree, and this other all evergreen tree over here, whatever that is. And the same 4 trees are down here. The difference is you have the maple tree here is much more abundant relative to the others. So whenever we do a diversity calculation in biology and ecology, we always take into account 2 main components, not just the number of species, that is the first one, it's called species richness, but we also take into account relative abundance. And so, for example, here's one simple way to calculate a diversity index on 2 different populations. I'm going to teach you the Shannon-Weiner diversity index. And it's calculated as the diversity index, this H here, is equal to the negative sum of P sub I times the natural log of P sub I. And this is where P sub I is the proportion of individuals in the sample that belong to that species I. Okay? Now the values usually fall somewhere between 1.5 and 3.5, and the higher the value, the better. So if I were to look at this example here where we have species 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and here are the relative abundances of those 5 species. In order to calculate the P sub I, you simply take the absolute abundance of each species and divide it by the total abundance. And so if you add up all of these abundances, I make it nice and easy here, it adds up to 100. So 50 divided by 100 is 0.5, 30 divided by 100 is 0.3, and so forth. And of course, these the P sub I numbers should all add up to 1 because they are frequencies. So to finish the calculation of the diversity index, you simply do P sub I times the natural log of P sub I. And so those numbers come out to be these, and then you sum all of that up and take the negative of it. Right? So you sum it up, it's 1.201, and then you take the negative of it, and you get a positive number, 1.201. So if we come back to this example, we all kind of, eyeballing it said community 1 is more diverse, but if you're out in a big huge forest, it's kind of easy. You can't just eyeball this, right? And so you actually do want to do a scientific study where you can actually show the numbers, to some legislative body who's deciding, should we build a road through community 1 or community 2, which will have the least amount of impact. And as an ecologist, you want to be able to tell them with actual numbers, right, and say, well, we did a study and this is the one where you should build a road. Or if the government has a certain amount of money to preserve an area and make it a natural preserve, which area should we preserve? And we could inform them it would be best, the money would be best spent over in this area because it's more diverse. So let's do this calculations here. Here we have 5 trees of each species. So the P sub I, natural log P sub I, is going to be negative 0.35 for each of the 5. So that ends up being, if you sum all of that up, 1.39. If you look at the community 2, you've got 16 of the one tree, 2 of the other, and 1 and 1. So the natural log, or I'm sorry, the P sub I times the natural log of P sub I for each of those is going to be negative 0.18, negative 0.23, and negative 0.15 for the last 2. And so you end up there with a 0.71 diversity index. And so clearly community 1 is more diverse. And that's how you calculate a diversity index like the Shannon-Weiner diversity index. And there are others as well. So also at the community ecology level is where we look at how organisms interact with each other. And it turns out this is kind of a nice summary of the way organisms can interact with each other. You can have a negative relationship, so this is the effect on one species and the effect on the other species. You can have negative where we call that competition, a negative neutral, amensalism, a negative positive like predation, herbivory, parasitism, and so forth, a positive neutral, commensalism, and a positive mutualism. Here's some examples of these in case you're unfamiliar. Amensalism is where it was negative for one but neutral for the other, and this is like a cow walking on a grass, because right, the cow doesn't care if he's walking on grass or flowers or road or whatever, but for the grass it is a negative. Commensalism is where it was positive for one but neutral for the other. And so this is like it's positive for the bird to have a nest up in a tree. And the tree really doesn't care. Competition was the negative-negative interaction. This is what has been demonstrated over and over again. This is a classic example where two paramecium species were grown up in separate cultures, and they basically had this nice little logistic curve. But when you grow them up in the same culture together, Paramecium caudatum outcompetes Paramecium aurelium. And you can see for a while they're both growing just kind of fine, but then caudatum outcompetes aurelium and becomes the dominant species in the community. This has actually been looked at in nature as well. In this example, these are barnacles that are attached to these rocks. Tmolus happens to live higher up, going up to high tide, and Balanus lives from low tide up to this certain point, about 3/4 of the way up. But there's this nice little division here. And so someone said, well, what would happen if I scrape off Tmolus? And so they went in and scraped off all of the Tmolus, and it turned out Balanus was happy to live this high up. However, once time started to pass, the Tmolus species came back in and started to recolonate here. And Tmolus is a better competitor higher up, and Balanus is a better competitor lower down. So what this ends up doing is species that are using the same area, the same resources, like those two barnacle species, end up subdividing so that each has their own special niche. This is a word that we use in business even. You have to have a niche or you won't survive. And so organisms do this all the time. Insects, for example, have had this huge diversification in evolution with their mouth parts, where their mouth parts give them a different niche in the environment. So we can restate the competitive exclusion principle basically by saying that two species cannot coexist in a community if their niches are identical, right? Like those two paramecium species, one outcompeted the other. So if two organisms have the exact same niche, one is going to outcompete the other. So a lot of times what will happen is they will separate just slightly so that they have two separate niches. The next interaction, positive-negative, is predation. This is where organisms eat other organisms, right? This includes herbivory, so like this insect eating another insect, the caterpillar eating the plant, or this snake eating a frog. And the one thing that happens with predators is they end up having these amazing evolutionary adaptations too to make them be a successful predator, like the great white shark, right, with its numerous adaptations. Or perhaps a wasp with a stinger. By the way, stingers are basically ovipositors that have been evolved to become a stinger, right, instead of just an ovipositor. So only female wasps and bees and ants can sting. Male wasps, bees, and ants do not sting. Scorpion with big pinchers and also with their evolved stingers, snakes with their fangs and so forth, bears with claws. So plants cannot get up and run away if they're going to be eaten. Rather, they have evolved different kinds of defenses, things like chemical toxins, such as strychnos toxifera, right, the plant responsible for strychnine. Peppermint and cinnamon and cloves, these are all plants' ways of defending against insects from eating them, and we take advantage of them and use them as spices. Spines and thorns have been used by plants to dissuade predators from eating them. Animals have different strategies. One of the things they can do is hide, right? So a little animal can just hide away and no one will ever find it. Or you could also use active defenses such as running away or getting away or even defending themselves. For example, here's these smaller birds are warding off the larger bird, and so that's called mobbing. So a bunch of smaller organisms can actually ward off a larger one. Or animals will warn each other. Primates are famous for calling out to each other and letting them know when there is a dangerous animal. If a panther comes walking through here, the monkeys will each talk to each other and say, hey, watch out, here comes a predator. Some organisms will even direct the attention of the predator away from vulnerable prey, like their young. So here's a killdeer that's acting like it's injured, and it makes the the wolf or the coyote or whatever it is to follow it, and so that it doesn't go and get the young birds. Camouflage is another strategy, or cryptic coloration, where organisms have evolved to look like their surroundings so you can't see them. Here's a few examples of this. We've got the walking stick, the leaf insects, which are closely related to the walking sticks, these moths that look like leaves. You know, here's a praying mantis that looks like leaves on the outside. If you turn this over, it looks just like a praying mantis from your garden here in North America. Some animals also have chemical defenses, like the plants, like this bombardier beetle or skunks. And some animals also use that chemical defenses as poisons, and then they need to let everyone know I'm poisonous. And so this a lot of times are animals that are brightly colored, okay, like these poison dart frogs. As these different characteristics have evolved over time, organisms have also started to mimic the beneficial characteristics of other organisms. So here is an actual, you may look at this and say, oh, that's like a snake's head. Actually, this is a caterpillar, and this is the end of the caterpillar. Its head is up here. And what this caterpillar does is it mimics the head of a snake. I mean, look at, you can see the eyes. There are some of these species that even have a little flickering tongue-like structure that comes out. And of course, what they're doing here is they're mimicking the snake, right? And so a bird comes along and doesn't want to get close because it looks like a snake instead of a juicy caterpillar. That's called Batesian mimicry, where a harmless imitates a harmful. Mullerian mimicry is where you have two harmful species that mimic each other to send out that message even stronger. It's like advertising on all channels of the television. So wasps are famous for this because they generally have the yellow-black pattern, striped pattern, and they look very similar. And so it's very clear, don't get near that insect because that insect could sting you. Parasitism is another type of interaction that happens. And parasitism can be, you know, like this tapeworm or this plasmodium. So the parasite lives inside of the host and obtains its nutrients from the host. Mutualism is where organisms both are benefited, like the case of, you know, Finding Nemo here, or the clownfish and the anemone. Ants guarding a plant so that these seeds will be protected and not eaten in other ways, and then the ants eventually take these off, pluck them, and take them down the ground and eventually plant them as almost seeds, essentially. You can even have very complex interactions, like a caterpillar that's biting on a leaf here. The leaf recognizes it, detects it, releases this volatile attractant, so releases a chemical. It's picked up by this little tiny micro-wasp. The micro-wasp comes in, finds the caterpillar, injects eggs through the body wall of the caterpillar that grow up and then eventually eat the caterpillar from the inside out. So, I mean, there's just some amazing interactions that happen all across biology.